"It's just decorative junk, sir. $300. Take it or leave it." The young woman behind the counter barely looked up from her clipboard as she said it, dismissing the battered shotgun like it was a rusted garden tool. The old man in the faded denim jacket didn't argue. He didn't correct her. He just stared at the weapon on the table, his weathered hands trembling slightly, because he had seen that exact pattern of stamping before. Not in a book, not in a museum, but in a muddy crate pulled from a forgotten armory in 1968. What the auction house had labelled as worthless was, to him, a ghost. A piece of American history that had somehow survived 107 years to end up on a folding table in a small-town warehouse, waiting to be tossed aside. If you believe that no veteran's eye should ever be ignored, that experience is worth more than any college degree. Type the word respect in the comments before this story continues, because what you're about to hear is a true testament to the kind of knowledge that only decades of service can give a man. This is the story of how one quiet Marine, dismissed and overlooked at a country auction, turned a $300 piece of junk into a $28,000 national treasure. His name was Harlan Bishop, and at 77 years old he had the kind of face that told you nothing and everything at the same time. Deep lines around the eyes from squinting through scopes in 3 different decades. A jaw set in the permanent half-clench of a man who had learned long ago that words were expensive and silence was free. He lived alone in a small clapboard house outside Beaver Dam, Kentucky, in a town so small that the post office shared a building with the feed store. Harlan had served 28 years in the United States Marine Corps, retiring as a gunnery sergeant in 1993, and during those years he had worked in an armory specialty unit that catalogued, restored, and verified historical American military weapons for the Marine Corps Museum. He knew firearms the way a country doctor knew the people in his town, by their scars, by their stories, by the marks no one else thought to look for. But the world had moved on from men like Harlan. His wife had passed in 2019. His pension covered the bills, but not much else. And on Saturday mornings, he drove 22 miles in his 1998 Ford F-150 to walk the rows of the Henderson County Estate Auction, looking for nothing in particular and everything at once. The auction house was a converted tobacco warehouse, with concrete floors and fluorescent lights that buzzed like wasps overhead. The October morning Harlan arrived. The crowd was thin, a few antique dealers from Owensboro, a young couple looking for cheap furniture, and 3 teenagers who had wandered in out of boredom. The shotgun was lying on a table near the back, behind a stack of mismatched dinner plates and an old sewing machine. The barrel was pitted with surface rust, the wooden stock was cracked at the wrist, and the heat shield was caked in what looked like decades of attic dust. A cardboard tag tied to the trigger guard read, "Old shotgun, decorative, $300 reserve." That was it. No make, no model, no era. Just 3 words and a number that told Harlan everything he needed to know about the people running this auction. They had no idea what they had. And as he leaned closer, careful not to touch the weapon yet, his heart began to beat the way it used to beat, right before a long-distance shot. Slow, steady, focused. Because he had recognized something impossible. The bayonet lug was the first thing that caught his eye. Most civilian Winchester Model 1897s never had one. That lug was a military modification, machined onto the barrel for the trench warfare version that the Army Ordnance Department had ordered in 1917. But it wasn't just the presence of the lug that made Harlan's pulse quicken. It was the pattern of the milling marks around it, the specific cut that only the Winchester New Haven factory had used for the first production run of trench guns shipped to France in the spring of 1918. He had handled exactly 4 of those barrels in his career. 4, and he knew the cut the way a sommelier knew a vintage. Then his eyes moved to the heat shield, that perforated metal sleeve that protected a soldier's hand from a barrel hot enough to fry an egg after rapid fire. Under the dust, just barely visible, was a serial number stamped in a font that hadn't been used after 1919, and finally, on the underside of the receiver, half hidden by a smear of old gun oil, he saw it. A tiny eagle's head over the letters JSB. The inspector's mark of John S. Brown, a War Department arms inspector who had personally certified fewer than 900 trench shotguns before his death in the influenza pandemic of 1919. A young man in a polo shirt with the auction house logo walked over, clipboard in hand, clearly bored. "You interested in that, sir? Like the tag says, it's decorative. 300. We can't go any lower than that, even though, honestly, between you and me, I don't even know if anyone will bid on it." Harlan looked up slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain that what the boy was calling decorative was, in his estimation, one of perhaps 200 surviving Winchester Model 1897 trench guns from the original 1918 contract, and almost certainly the only one with an intact John S. Brown Inspector's mark to surface in private hands in the last 15 years. He just nodded once and asked very politely if he could pay cash and take it home that afternoon. The young man laughed, actually laughed, and called over to a co-worker. "Hey, Brittany, this gentleman wants the rusty old thing in the back. Looks like we're going to unload it after all." Harlan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had been dismissed before. He had been dismissed by drill instructors, by officers, by enemies in 3 countries. He had outlived them all. He paid $310, $300 for the gun, $10 for the buyer's premium. Wrapped the shotgun in an old wool blanket from his truck and drove home with it laid carefully across the passenger seat like a sleeping child. That night, in the small detached garage behind his house, he set up his workbench under a single hanging light bulb and laid the weapon out on a clean canvas drop cloth. He didn't touch it for almost an hour. He just looked at it. He thought about the young man, probably 19 or 20 years old, who had carried this exact shotgun through the trenches of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He thought about the rapid-fire technique called slam firing that made the Model 1897 so devastating in close quarters that the German government had filed a formal diplomatic protest demanding the United States stop using it. He thought about his own grandfather, who had served in that same offensive, and who had told him stories as a boy about a weapon called the trench broom that swept enemy positions clean. And then, finally, Harlan rolled up his sleeves, opened his case of restoration tools and got to work. The restoration took the entire weekend. Harlan worked the way he had been taught at the Marine Corps Museum, slowly, reverently, never removing original metal, never sanding away history. He used a soft brass brush and museum-grade solvent to dissolve the surface rust, without harming the underlying bluing. He stabilized the crack in the walnut stock with a hairline injection of conservation-grade adhesive, then hand-rubbed the wood with linseed oil the way his old chief had shown him in 1971. He carefully cleaned around the inspector's mark with a cotton swab and a magnifying lamp, taking photographs at every stage so the chain of custody would be unbroken. He did not refinish. He did not replace. He did not modernize. By Sunday evening, the weapon that had looked like a piece of forgotten junk on a folding table looked like exactly what it was. A battered, weary, honest survivor of the Great War, dignified once more. Harlan sat in his garage that night, drinking black coffee, and he did something he hadn't done since his wife's funeral. He cried, quietly, for about 10 minutes. And then he wiped his face and started building a file. For the next 4 months, Harlan did the work that the auction house had been too lazy or too incompetent to do. He drove to the Cody Firearms Museum Records office in Wyoming, where he paid for a factory letter that confirmed the serial number had been shipped on a US government contract in March of 1918. He contacted a retired arms historian he had known for 30 years, a man who had literally written the textbook on WWI trench weapons, and obtained a signed letter of authentication. He pulled records from the National Archives proving the unit that had received the contract shipment. He compiled photographs, restoration logs, comparison studies of other documented examples, and a notarized statement of his own credentials as a former Marine Corps Museum arms specialist. By the time February arrived, the manila folder was over 200 pages thick, and then Harlan made a phone call to a major arms auction house in Rock Island, Illinois, the most respected auctioneer of historical American military firearms in the country, and asked, in his quiet Kentucky drawl, if they might be interested in a verified Winchester Model 1897 trench gun with a John S. Brown inspector's mark. The room at the Rock Island Auction Company on the day of the sale was packed. Collectors had flown in from as far as Belgium and Japan. Dealers from the Smithsonian had sent a representative, and in the back row, in a clean but plain grey suit that had belonged to his late brother, sat Harlan Bishop, his hands folded in his lap, his face giving away nothing. When his lot came up on the screen, Lot 1148, Winchester Model 1897 trench gun, 1918 contract, JS, Brown inspection. The auctioneer paused for a moment, looked toward the back of the room and said something Harlan would remember for the rest of his life. "Folks, before we begin bidding, I'd like to acknowledge the gentleman who can sign this piece. Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Bishop, United States Marine Corps, retired. 28 years of service, 12 of those in historical arms verification. Sergeant, would you stand, sir?" Harlan stood. The room turned. And then, slowly, every single person in that auction hall rose to their feet and applauded. The bidding opened at $8,000. Within 90 seconds it had passed 15. Two collectors from the East Coast were bidding against a museum acquisitions officer and a private buyer from Texas. The numbers climbed in increments of 1,000, then 2,000, then 5. At 24,000 the room went silent except for the rhythmic call of the auctioneer. At 26 it slowed. At 27.5 there was one last raised paddle, and then, with a single sharp crack of the gavel, lot 1,148 sold for $28,000 to the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, where it would be placed on permanent display in the trench warfare exhibit, with a small bronze plaque crediting its restoration and verification to Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Bishop, USMC. The young man from the country auction house, the one who had called the shotgun decorative junk, was, by some strange coincidence, watching a live stream of the sale from his apartment that afternoon. He reportedly did not finish his coffee. 6 weeks later, Harlan received a letter from the curator of the National World War I Museum, inviting him to attend the unveiling of the exhibit. He drove the 412 miles to Kansas City in his old Ford pickup, alone. At the museum, under soft gallery lighting behind a panel of museum glass, his shotgun was displayed beside a mannequin in a 1918 doughboy uniform. The bronze plaque beneath it bore his name. A young curator, perhaps 30 years old, walked up to him and shook his hand and said, "Sergeant, we want you to know. Without your eye, this would have ended up in someone's barn or worse. You didn't just restore a weapon. You restored a story. You gave a voice back to every man who carried one of these into hell and never came home." Harlan nodded, his jaw working the way it always did when he was trying not to let his eyes fill up. He looked at the shotgun behind the glass for a long moment. Then he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, not for himself, but for the 19-year-old boy from 1918 who had carried it first. And the moral of this story, my friends, is one that every American ought to remember. Never, ever judge a man by his appearance. Never assume that the quiet old veteran in the worn jacket has nothing to teach you. Because the years that bent his back also sharpened his eye. The hands that look weathered and useless have held history, and the silence he keeps is not emptiness. It is the weight of everything he has seen, everything he has saved, and everything he is still trying to protect for the rest of us. If this story moved you, if you believe that our veterans deserve more than dismissal and folding tables and $300 tags, then please subscribe to this channel right now and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the bell so you never miss another story of hidden heroes among us, and in the comments below, tell me, where would Harlan Bishop's shotgun have ended up if he hadn't walked into that auction house that October morning? Because somewhere out there right now there is another piece of American history sitting on another folding table, waiting for the right pair of eyes to find it, and there is another old veteran, quiet and overlooked, who is exactly the right man for the job. God bless him, and God bless all who served.